de mi vida dejó de avanzar. La luz del día dejó de brillar. En la oscuridad no podemos cantar. Muy solo estoy, en las tinieblas lloraré. Muy solo estoy, en las tinieblas lloraré. Muy solo estoy, en las tinieblas lloraré. El pito de un tren se empieza a escuchar. Estamos llegando a la claridad. Las almas perdidas quieren llorar. Estamos llegando a la claridad. Qué feliz estoy, en las tinieblas no estaré. 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 Qué feliz estoy, en las
Destroy the Empire!
Hello, everyone. Good afternoon. My name is Aurora Santiago Ortiz, and I am thrilled, absolutely thrilled to be here with all of you for the presentation of the lettered Barriada. Before we actually get into the speakers and conversation, I'm going to pass it over to Colectivo Babilla, and they will have a few words with to tell us about translation. So I will pass it over to them.
Hola, hola, hello, hello. Hi everyone, hola a todos. I'm going to say these instructions on how to use the interpretation feature in English and then in Spanish consecutively. Hola a todos, voy a compartir estas instrucciones de cómo usar la función de interpretación por Zoom brevemente en inglés y en español consecutivamente. My name is Pau. I use they, them pronouns. I'm part of Colectivo Babilla. I will be your English to Spanish and Spanish to English simultaneous interpreter along with my co-interpreter Cristóbal. Hola a todos, me llamo Pau, uso pronombre ella, voy a ser intérprete de hoy de simultáneo del inglés al español y del español al inglés con mi co-interpreter Cristóbal. So the interpretation feature will be activated very briefly, and you will see a pop icon of a globe at the bottom hand corner of your screen. There you can click on that and select the language that you would like to hear interpretation into, as we can see here on the screen. So vamos a activar la función de interpretación brevemente. Van a ver un icono de un globo en el fondo a la derecha de su pantalla, que ahí va a decir interpretación. Ahí pueden hacer clic y escoger el lenguaje que quieren escuchar la interpretación. Just a brief language justice practices that we want to share with y'all. Please remember to speak at a moderate pace. We also ask for everyone, if you're reading anything, to read at a slower pace. We tend to read a lot faster than we speak. And a little note that I will be interpreting using inclusive language. Un recordatorio de por favor hablar a un paso moderado. También si van a leer algo, por favor léanlo a un paso más despacio. Normalmente leemos mucho más rápido de lo que hablamos. Y voy a usar el lenguaje inclusivo para interpretar en el día de hoy. Que tengan buen evento. I hope you have a wonderful event. Thank you. Gracias.
Hola, buenas tardes a todas y todos. Hello, everyone, and welcome. It is my great pleasure to introduce today's moderator. So Aurora Santiago Ortiz is a social justice education scholar and Lyman T. Johnson postdoctoral fellow at the University of Kentucky. Her research focuses on anti-racist feminisms, decolonial perspectives, popular education, and participatory action research. She holds a PhD from the University of Massachusetts-Amherst, a Juris Doctor from the University of Puerto Rico School of Law, and a BFA in Film and TV from NYU's Tisch School of the Arts. Her work has been published in the Michigan Journal for Community Service Learning, Tracce Urbane, Italian Journal of Urban Studies, and in Chicana Latina Studies Journal. She has also been a contributor to Society and Space, The Abusable Past, a blog of the Radical History Review, Electric Marronage, and Sora Magazine. She's also a co-founder and member of the community organization Colectivo Casco Urbano de Calle. Gracias, Aurora.
Muchas gracias. Thank you, Jorell. I am very proud and excited to introduce all of the panelists today that are going to be sharing space and talking about the lettered Barriada. I will begin in order with Marisol LeBrón and read everyone's bio before getting into it. So Marisol LeBrón is Associate Professor in Feminist Studies and Critical Race and Ethnic Studies at the University of California, Santa Cruz. She is author of Against Puerto Rico, Lessons from the Verano Boricua from Editora Educación Emergente, and Policing Life and Death, Race, Violence, and Resistance in Puerto Rico from the University of California Press. Along with Jerimar Bonilla, she is the co-editor of Aftershocks of Disaster, Puerto Rico Before and After the Storm Haymarket Books. She is also one of the co-creators of the Puerto Rico Syllabus, a digital humanities project about the Puerto Rican debt crisis. And after Marisol, we have Joaquín Villanueva, who is a critical human geographer based at Gustavus Adolphus College in Minnesota. A graduate of the University of Puerto Rico and Syracuse University, he has conducted research on urban political economy and carceral geographies in Paris, New York, and San Juan. Currently, Joaquín is working on his first book on the origins of the planning board and the geographies of imperialism in Puerto Rico from 1940 to 1959. His work has been published in Anapod, Society in Space, NACLA, and ACME, among other journals. And he is the current president of the Puerto Rican Studies Association and serves on the board of the Caribbean Geography Specialty Group of the American Association of Geographers. Welcome, Joaquín. And Agustín Laó-Montes is Associate Professor of Sociology and Afro-American Studies at the University of Massachusetts, Amherst, where he is also affiliated with the Center for Latin American, Caribbean, and Latinx Studies. His academic fields include world historical sociology, decolonial critique, Africana studies, political sociology, urban studies, and Latin American and Caribbean studies. He's an intellectual activist in various fronts, including being part of the coordinating committee of the Articulación Regional Afrodescendiente en América Latina y el Caribe, ARAC. His last book in Spanish is titled Contrapunteos Diaspóricos, Cartografías Políticas de Nuestra Afroamérica, and has 2 forthcoming volumes. His co-authored Du Bois on Latin America and the Caribbean, Trans-American Pan-Africanism and Global Sociology, and Creolizing Ubuntu, Cartographies of the Political in Our Afroamérica. And we have the author of The Lettered Barriada, and his name is Jorell Meléndez-Badillo. And he is an assistant professor of history at Dartmouth College. His work focuses on the global circulation of radical ideas from the standpoint of working class intellectual communities in Puerto Rico, the Caribbean, and Las Americas. His work has appeared in Hispanic American Historical Review, Caribbean Studies Journal, International Labor and Working Class History Journal, among others. He is the author of Voces Libertarias, Orígenes del Anarquismo en Puerto Rico, with a forthcoming 4th edition with Editorial Aquelarre, co-editor of Without Borders or Limits, an interdisciplinary approach to anarchist studies from Cambridge Scholars Publishers, editor of Páginas Libres, breve antología del pensamiento anarquista en Puerto Rico, con editora Educación Emergente, and The Lettered Barriada, Workers, Archival Power, and the Politics of Knowledge in Puerto Rico from Duke University Press. And he is currently working on a book for Princeton University Press titled Puerto Rico, A National History. So without further ado, I'm so excited to be here with all of you, and I will pass it on to Marisol, LeBrón.
Hi, everyone. Thank you so much for the introduction. I'm really excited to be here today. So, I want to start off by thanking Jorell for the invitation to be here and to be in conversation about this incredible book, The Lettered Barriada. I'm going to try to keep my comments on the briefer side because I really want to make some time for and space for conversation. So the first thing I want to say before I get into some of the specifics around the argument and methodology of the book is that I really enjoyed the book because you can see the trajectory of Jorell's thinking around questions of labor, power, and politics, both where it's been as well as where it's headed. His first book, as Aurora mentioned, Voces Libertarias, was initially published in 2013 and is now in its 3rd or about to be 4th edition, I guess, speaking to the endurance of its importance. In Voces Libertarias, Jorell traces the development of anarchist thinking and organizing in Puerto Rico. He shows how Puerto Rican workers participated in a global community of radical thinkers and worked to transform their conditions at home, which put them into often direct confrontation with the state as well as organized labor. In many ways, Voces Libertarias has been a springboard for the ideas and themes that Jorell has continued to develop in his research and writing throughout his career. It also speaks to his commitment to creating a record of forgotten political currents and radical thinkers who have been marginalized and silenced. This dedication to building archives and creating accessible histories is also evidenced by his recently published edited volume, Páginas Libres, which was also published almost simultaneously with The Lettered Barriada and brings together key texts and primary sources related to anarchist political thought in Puerto Rico. So, for me reading the book, I was really struck by this kind of the way in which this trajectory weaves itself throughout the narrative. And it's really a wonderful thing to be able to read a book and to see and track a scholar's thinking and how it's shifted and grown. And to also start to see initial rumblings of future lines of inquiry, right? That, all that to say, I'm excited for what comes next. Even though I'm here to talk about the letter Barriada, I did want to say that I'm really excited to see where and the parts in the book where I could see where Jorell's headed next. So now I'll actually get back to the letter Barriada. So the letter Barriada is singular in both the scope and depth of its archival research, and it promises to open up new areas of engagement as well as future paths for investigation for Puerto Rican and Latin American studies scholars. The book promises to become indispensable within the field of Puerto Rican studies, particularly in its focus on illuminating little-known historical actors to tell us something new about how Puerto Ricans have negotiated the imposition of U.S. rule and how they imagine themselves as part of vast intellectual communities that exceeded the boundaries of the archipelago. So in my comments today, I want to focus on 3 ways in which the book is a major contribution to Puerto Rican studies. So the first is its emphasis and indeed insistence on a global or transnational Puerto Rican subject. The second is its careful discussion of how radical currents can become co-opted and instrumentalized in exclusionary nationalist projects. And the last is the book's perhaps reluctant role, as archive. So I appreciated the way that the letter Barriada presents a picture of Puerto Ricans as enmeshed in, as opposed to isolated from, larger global and regional trends. In the book, Jorell pushes back against the idea that Puerto Ricans, especially the working classes, were insular in their thinking and practice. He has this great line in the book, in the introduction, where he says that literate obreros were able to pick up a working class newspaper and, quote, imagine himself as a global subject, all without having to leave the cafetín, end quote. And focusing on the circulation of ideas and print culture when the physical mobility of the working class itself was circumscribed, he's able to document how Puerto Ricans participated in transnational intellectual communities. This shatters the myth of insularismo that runs through many histories of Puerto Rico during the early part of the 20th century. As he notes in the second chapter of the book, quote, during the first decade of the 20th century, obreros ilustrados took an active role in the global circulation of labor ideas. Puerto Rican workers published articles in New York City's Cultura Obrera, exchanged publications with European anarchists, and collectively discussed newspapers coming from different parts of Latin America, end quote. Puerto Rican workers understood themselves as part of a global community, and this formed a key part of their sense of self and their struggle for dignity. As he traces Labor Day and May Day became key rituals in this assertion of a global community. This to me is a critical move and an important contribution because it helps us to think about some of the less obvious ways in which Puerto Ricans may have contested the isolating effects of colonial rule. If what colonialism endeavors to do is sever Puerto Rico from the international community by binding it exclusively to the United States through this colonial relationship, then these efforts to understand Puerto Rico as a part of the world beyond the archipelago and the metropole work to challenge the notion that Puerto Ricans are alone. These transnational gestures, even if they only remain in the realm of intellectual exchange, are crucial for building the kinds of solidarity necessary for upending oppressive structures. While Jorell mines the radical potential of these transnational exchanges, he also views them with a critical eye, showing how they also function to reify a form of Western universalism that reinforces structures of sexism and anti-Blackness in the archipelago. In, quote, yearning to emulate their international peers, end quote, as Jorell puts it, obreros ilustrados projected themselves as civilized and moral at the expense of more marginalized populations, including women, Black people, and non-skilled workers who were silenced. These appeals to the universal as part of the obreros ilustrados function on the part, of obreros ilustrados function to enliven a code of respectability that deeply shaped the trajectory of working class political participation, as Jorell shows throughout the rest of the book. Related to this last point, another major contribution of the book, and one that extends us beyond Puerto Rican studies, is the way that Jorell carefully and painstakingly shows how radical ideas can become co-opted and instrumentalized in exclusionary nationalist projects. We see this throughout the book, but perhaps nowhere clearer than in the conclusion. In the conclusion to the book, we see how the PPD appropriated its social justice platform from the Socialist Party, hastening its decline. Muñoz Marín and the PPD leadership learned from the Socialist Party and the FTL the importance of not only crafting the narrative, but also controlling the intellectual and cultural means of production in order to solidify and circulate their narrative. Indeed, in Operation Serenity, the cultural component, or the flip side to Operation Bootstrap, we see echoes of the narratives and myths built brick by brick in the lettered Barriada. The silences which congealed in the trope of the Jíbaro as nation were drawn from the silences that emerged as Obreros Ilustrados sought to create an image of the Puerto Rican working class as moral and civilized global subjects. Nonetheless, the resonance of the PPD's cultural program, the notion that it was just a recycled version of the old socialist program, helped to lend credibility to the project of the Commonwealth and the reinstantiation of a colonial relation that would lead to the continued immiseration of the working classes. The last point I want to discuss before turning it back to Aurora or to handing it over to Joaquín is the letter Barriada's importance, not just because of how it engages archives, but also as an archive. Throughout the book, we see Jorell working to expand and complicate our understanding of what constitutes the archive. Indeed, he works to decenter what we think of as the traditional or official archive, asking us to consider the marginal, the ephemeral, and that which only leaves traces. He also asks us to listen to the silences produced by the archive, even those archives that we might consider to be more radical or alternative. But perhaps the most important contribution of this book, and the one that Jorell likely didn't have in mind as he set out to write the book, is the book as archive. I had the opportunity to interview Jorell recently for the Abusable Past, and I can share the link in the chat. But one of the things that we spoke about was the precarious state of the archipelago's archives. One of the key archives used in the letter Barriada, the Centro de Documentación Obrera at UPR Humacao, in particular, has experienced destruction to its infrastructure and materials in the wake of Hurricane Maria and the mismanagement that followed. In the interview, Jorell noted that if he was to write the book today, he likely would not have access to many of the materials that he used due to the fragile state of many of the archipelago's archives, and in particular, the Centro de Documentación. Due to this negligence and, or I would argue, erasure, the letter Barriada is in many ways converted into an archive, albeit one that is incomplete and mediated. It may be the only access to sources that have been destroyed by water, humidity, or mold, or that may have just been unceremoniously disposed of. When I think of this, I'm even more grateful for the existence of this book and the work that it does to create a snapshot of what might be a damaged and compromised archive. The fact that there might be archival sources that are only accessible through this book is a reminder of the frailty of these alternative archives. As Jorell shows, even though this ideational archive, as he calls it, is foundational to the national myths that became cemented following the establishment of the Commonwealth, and despite all of its faults, the letter Barriada was an archive that was never supposed to exist, right? And I think the existence of this book and the kind of work that it does to collect these sources really drives that home. So I'm gonna stop there, but I just wanna say thank you, Jorell, for the incredible gift that you've given us with this book.
Thank you so much, Marisol. We're going to pass it on now to Joaquín Villanueva. So whenever you're ready, you can turn on your camera and voice.
Thank you again, Jorell, for the invitation to be here. I am honored to be in such a great company. And I think Marisol's comments really set up the stage nicely for you contextualize the work much in a larger context than I will provide. But I'm really happy to be commenting on this book, as I've been anticipating this book for a long time, and we've been having conversations about it with Jorell for a while as well. So according to Jorell, the letter Barriada tells the story of how a cluster of self-educated working men were able to go from producing knowledge within their workshops and labor unions in the margins of Puerto Rico's cultural and intellectual elite to becoming highly respected politicians and statesmen. The book takes us through that journey from the margins to the center of colonial society, in documenting how a group of working men went from living marginal lives in the colony to occupying center stage in the theater of colonial politics. Jorell resists the temptation of romanticizing and or fictionalizing the heroic feat of these enlightened workers. Rather, this is a book about contradictions of how, as Jorell puts it, techniques of racial and gender silencing, ghosting, and erasure also took place in the margins. From the outset, we see how Jorell breaks away from conventional historical narratives and disciplinary paradigms. For instance, the lack of access to archival sources, as Marisol explained, does not presuppose limits to what can be said, but rather present themselves as opportunities to resort to the realm of speculation and imagination. This is a necessary creative move, given how countless stories from the margins remained excluded from the archives precisely because they did not fit any of the competing archives that generated what we have inherited as historical knowledge. So how, then, could self-educated working men create historical knowledge, given their marginal positions in the social world of plantation and colonial capitalism? This question regarding how historical knowledge of self-educated workers came to be has been relegated, no pun intended, to the margins of historical debates and labor histories of Puerto Rico. What Jorell is asking us to do is to also question the heroic and foundational stories of the labor movement. Throughout the book, Jorell provides us with a wide array of analytical, conceptual, and methodological tactics to critically tackle the archives, narratives, and knowledges that these self-educated workers produced and that contemporary historians continue to reproduce. To guide us, Jorell begins by defining the objects and subjects of analysis. Throughout, he considers not only the physical archives that self-educated workers created, those rooms and buildings where documents and archival material were stored, but also what he calls the ideational archives, the non-material archives that came to life through the print word, such as discourses and narratives produced in books and print media published by workers themselves. These ideational archives have become key historical sources that support, legitimize, and give credibility to the various myths that continue to dominate labor histories of Puerto Rico. Jorell does not take those archival sources for granted. Instead, he considers these self-educated workers as historical narrators. In that role, Obreros Ilustrados got to dictate what was deemed important enough to become history. It was in that process of dissection, selection, and election of what constituted history that these historical actors, in order to be legible beyond their immediate world, had to reproduce the same tactics and logics that informed the official archives of the nation. In other words, as historical subjects with archival power, Obreros Ilustrados decided what would be considered legitimate working class knowledge and what was deemed important enough to be part of their history, as well as what and whom would be cast outside, excluded, and erased. Because Puerto Rico's labor history has been written from the perspective of these selective working class archives, Jorell is essentially asking us to reconsider how we talk and narrate the history of labor, and who do we leave behind when the archival source itself is not critically questioned. The book finds theoretical inspiration in Angel Rama's classic The Letter City, where Rama establishes a clear relationship between those who had access to the letter world of journalism and literature and the exercise of power across colonial and post-colonial Latin America. Even though Rama focuses almost exclusively on Latin American elites, Jorell uses the same framework to account for those uneven power relations within the laboring classes in the Caribbean. Access to the printed word, either through writing or reading, Jorell asserts, was a marker of social power and authority among the laboring masses. However, in following Rama for conceptualizing the Barriada, Jorell makes a fictional distinction between the social and physical space of workers' neighborhoods. As he puts it, understanding the letter Barriada, not only as a physical space, but also as a social one, allows me to look at the transnational dimensions of local processes. In doing this, Jorell claims to be able to conceive how workers became transnational subjects through the circulation of ideas via books, newspapers, and pamphlets. Nonetheless, such an analytical move underplays, I believe, the role of the physical everyday geographies inhabited and produced by workers. The barriadas, cafetín, mítines, centros, public plazas, casinos, and the arrabal, all these physical locations across Puerto Rico, where workers discussed, exchanged, produced, and consumed ideas, were also turned, I will say, into transnational spaces of collaboration, solidarity, and mutuality. In other words, workers transformed not just themselves into transnational subjects, but also their everyday geographies. Unintentionally, though, Jorell's book brings to our attention the fact that these workers were also geographical agents, that is, producers of transnational spaces that challenged the bounded geographical arrangements of plantation and colonial capitalism. I say unintentionally because one of the book's aims is precisely to document how these working men imagined themselves as historical subjects, as Jorell puts it. What if we also consider how these working men, to paraphrase Jorell, imagine themselves as geographical subjects? We see glimpses of these spatial practices throughout the book. For instance, in the working man newspaper El Combate from Arecibo, Obreros Ilustrados developed a discourse of urban spaces as civilized, delineating thus a clear spatial hierarchy between rural and urban workers, the latter in a privileged position, quote, to receive the influx of civilizing currents. Centros also were radical spaces produced and conceived by workers as pedagogical sites to disseminate and democratize knowledge. It was in those spaces that the ideal worker was imagined, trained, and later exported from the margins to the center of political life in Puerto Rico. These working class geographies, however, reproduce the same exclusive and Eurocentric logics that still haunt colonial life in Puerto Rico. For instance, some members of Centros shied away from their revolutionary ideals and instead used those spaces, according to Jorell, as a vehicle to become modern, which they equated with European modern culture. Similarly, Romero Rosa examined the everyday spaces, one of the Obreros Ilustrados, examined the everyday spaces of working class life through a sociological lens to highlight how artisan casinos, taverns, festivities, and neighborhood practices were filled with, as he said, vices and defects that our people cherish, and that today appear before our eyes as obstacles to the laws of modern progress. Obreros Ilustrados were not just historical subjects archiving knowledges as they imagined the future. They were also geographical subjects that actively produced and created spaces that were imagined as sites for the reproduction of a particular view of modernity, progress, and civilization. From these spaces, Obreros Ilustrados imagined the future, exchange ideas, and produce knowledges that allow them to enter the exclusive side of Puerto Rican political life. Deeper into the 20th century, as the networks and realms of power of the Socialist Party grew, Obreros Ilustrados were able to extend their spatial reach. As Jorell documents throughout the book, Obreros Ilustrados were able to actively participate in public events, attended conferences, and ruminated through the halls of Congress. Their presence in these privileged sites was also subject to controversy and protest. For example, the 1933 strike at the University of Puerto Rico, one of the most fascinating chapters of the book, was motivated by the appointment of an obrero ilustrado, Rafael Alonso Torres, to the university's Board of Trustees. This event clearly signaled that despite the success of the labor movement, access to particular spaces of knowledge production and exchange, such as the public university, were denied to them. Notwithstanding these exclusions, Obreros Ilustrados imagined themselves as global subjects, subjects able to imagine a world arranged differently. That is, they saw themselves as historical and geographical subjects. I end with a note about the present and future of Puerto Rico. As we speak, maestras and maestros have left the classroom and taken the streets to protest and demand better, fairer, and more just working conditions. They are walking through an old geography of resistance that takes them from El Capitolio to la Calle de la Resistencia, demanding change. This geography arouses fear among those in power, as the memory of the Verano del 19 is still very fresh in everyone's mind. These are contemporary workers that imagine themselves as geographical subjects that can occupy space to demand justice. Unlike the spaces created by Obreros Ilustrados, I see a more inclusive geography of justice emerging in the streets of Puerto Rico. The streets are becoming archives, historical sources that one day will serve for someone to write a historical geography of labor in Puerto Rico. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Joaquín Villanueva. I will now pass it on to Agustín Laó-Montes.
Well, I expreso en Spanglish. Expreso mi alegría, al igual que Marisol y Joaquín y Aurora por estar aquí y mi agradecimiento a Jorell por la invitación y por el libro. Y bueno, tengo un texto que quiero compartir para poder cumplir con el tiempo, pero antes quiero decir dos cosas. Una, que para mí una de las grandes alegrías del libro fue que me acordaba de la historia que me contaban mis abuelas, porque mis dos abuelos, que no llegué a conocer, eran tabaqueros socialistas. Y bueno, leyendo el libro de Jorell, pues me acordaba de las historias de mis abuelas, que son de aquellas que no están escritas en la historia. Y lo otro es que me alegré mucho de ver que en la portada y en algunas de las ilustraciones se rescató el arte, el libro como archivo, como dice Marisol. Se rescató el arte de mi amigo y antiguo profesor Kelvin Santiago Valles, que también es un artista. More than an honor, it's a pleasure to be in the crew who is presenting this book that surely will be a landmark not only in Puerto Rican studies, but in cosmopolitan engagement with labor and left histories in the Americas and beyond. The multi-layered narrative that configures its complex yet fluid and agile text could be described from a diversity of angles of vision. It can be situated in terms of two path-breaking moments in Puerto Rican historiography. The new history from below, championed by scholars associated with the Centro de Estudios de la Realidad Puertorriqueña, we celebrated its 50th anniversary recently, and Center for Puerto Rican Studies in the 1970s. and the rise of a new generation of critical Puerto Rican studies, on the other hand, as the author argues, that in recent years, and this is a quote, the field of Puerto Rican labor history has also moved toward much needed analysis of gender and race. This accounts for what I'll call a novísimo Puerto Rican historiography in the context of the political and epistemic cultural turn and decolonial turn that marks meaningful changes in the modes of production and politics of knowledge. Playing this drum, archival power and the politics of knowledge are key concerns, as spelled out in the book subtitle and as presented by the two colleagues in the panel. A striking feature of the book is the creative coining of a set of categories, beginning with the letter Barriada, which serve as title, material and ideational archive as traces of history of particular desires, ideas, and political projects, and counter archives of subjugated knowledges from working women as Paca Escabí, Luisa Capetillo, and Juana Colón, and the imperative to exercise historical imagination to rescue the unnamed, non-skilled, illiterate Black and female workers from historical erasure and oblivion, and which is the beginning at the end. The very last word is the name of the book. As the author explains since the introduction, the primary purpose of the book is to craft a history of the letter Barriada, to tell, quote, the story of how a cluster of self-educated working men were able to go from producing knowledge within their workshops and labor unions in the margins of Puerto Rico's cultural and intellectual elite to becoming highly respected politicians and statesmen, end quote. On that key, Jorell Meléndez-Badillo defines this group of male workers as obreros ilustrados who crafted, quote, a makeshift intellectual community referred to as Letter Barriada that came alive through the nexus of literary production and print culture, political participation, and labor rituals that reconfigured social and physical spaces, end quote. On that beat, he contends that the subject of the letter Barriada was discursively constructed as an enlightened, urban, raceless male worker, vis-a-vis the illiterate Black female rural laboring masses, which demonstrated how, quote, techniques of racial and gender silencing, ghosting, and erasure also took place in the margins. On that note, through the whole book, Meléndez-Badillo pursues a critical path of a sustained radical intersectional politics and epistemic practice, as we shall see, and as mentioned by Marisol and Joaquín. Here, I can't minimally present the rich historical thickness of the genealogy and story Jorell tells with poetic elegance, looking to capture the texture and smells of living history. The narration is beautiful. Carefully analyzing a repertoire of fundamental texts written by workers and elite letrados, describing public events, meetings, places, and spaces, highlighting key historical moments and contending projects and interpretation from the late 19th century to the late 1940s in Puerto Rico, all framed within a world historical and regional perspective, as clearly also argued by Marisol and Joaquín. Indeed, the book can be read as a blueprint for a novísimo Puerto Rican historiography out of an exercise of grounded theory and rooted critical politics, standing from an examination of the complexities, paradoxes, patterns, and contradictions of labor politics in early 20th century Puerto Rico, located in larger landscapes of power and knowledge in the region and in the world. And I also want to highlight that as my two colleagues. Hence, in what remains of my presentation, I will focus on three set of themes that inform the whole volume. First, how it explores what Jorell calls the complex and porous terrain of gender and racial politics. Second, the multiple meanings and expressions of coloniality and colonialism as manifested and debated in the letter Barriada and its others. And third, the political and epistemic implications of its investigation of the question of archival power for Puerto Rican studies in particular and for the decolonial turn in general. One of the principal arguments of the letter Barriada is that the erasures of women and black workers as historical subjects by obreros ilustrados were not deviations, quote, but integral to labor's ideational archive, which persists with great transhistorical power today, end quote. The complex and porous characters of such processes of exclusion are shown throughout the book. I'll offer a couple of examples of such contradictory terrain. The first is Luisa Capetillo, who, as the author contends, was the only working woman considered an obrera ilustrada. A pioneer of feminist politics in Puerto Rico, a leading union organizer, and anarchist, she was able to negotiate a presence in the male-dominated organized labor movement and intellectual community. The author argues that she gained, quote, respect for her militancy and literary production, but contingent on not transgressing the labor movement patriarchal ethos, as expressed by labor leaders. He also analyzes how she was detained in Cuba for, at the moment, a gender transgression of wearing pants as a, quote, micro-political act of an impure and performative nature, as a strategic move in which she performed masculinity and was accepted into the male-dominated letter Barriada while advocated for women's rights and liberties, end quote. Analogous to Paca Escabiz, another worker that is out of the archive of the ideational archive of the Obreros Ilustrados that is also discussed in the book, who use masculine noun when making demands of the 1905 convention of the Federación Libre de Trabajadores, another strategy of making her voice present in that context that erase the voices of women. My second example is Juan Vilar, a black anarchist, radical working class leader who died at a young age on May Day 1915. In his book Páginas Libres, published in 1914, Vilar displays the Occidentalist and Orientalist discourse that was common sense among the Obreros Ilustrados, arguing that, quote, Eastern cultures were superstitious, spiritual, and barbaric, while secular Western countries were symbols of progress and civilization, end quote. In the book, there is no mention of race, while slavery is deracialized as the opposite of freedom, and rural people are represented as lazy and sensual, traits associated with blackness. In that light, Meléndez-Badillo contends that Vilar was forgotten because he took part in the creation of a discourse and archive where there was no space for him. Unwittingly, he collaborated in the patterning of an archive in which anti-blackness did not necessarily account for the negation of black bodies from the letter Barriada. Jorell relates this paradoxical racial politics with Isar Godreau's analysis of the slippery semantics of blackness in Puerto Rico, where, quote, the fluidity of racial identifiers and add another layer to the already complicated task of knowledge archaeology, non-material archives that actively silence blackness, and of a possible Vilar de-Africanization tried to dignify blackness rooted in contemporaneous perceptions of respectability, end quote. And this is one example of how those complexities of racial politics are problematized throughout the book, as well as gender politics. This leads to the second theme, which is the question of coloniality and colonialism. The author frames the emergence of the letter Barriada in terms of the century Puerto Rico as within a colonial, in turn of the century Puerto Rico as within a colonial crossroads that determines the overall historical scenario. At the same time, he argues that, quote, participating in that imagined global community allowed Obreros Ilustrados to craft, project, and enforce the notion of an ideal worker, always male and raceless, in tune with Western rational projects and colonial logics, end quote. While the first statement refers more to inter-imperial competition and geopolitics, The second signifies coloniality as a formation of power, knowledge, and identity that informs the gender and racial politics, expressive cultures, and politics of knowledge within and beyond the letter barriada. In that beat, the tensions and debates about Puerto Rican political status were important, but not the sole and often not the main political stakes within the politics of labor and left wing politics. Playing this drum, decolonization means more than dismantling colonial administration. For instance, there is a Church Occidentalist discourse in strands of the Federación Libre de Trabajadores and Partido Socialista who were for independence, like Ramon Romero Rosa, or for the annexation to the U.S., as in Santiago Iglesias Mantin. Because of
Agustín, más
yeah?
lento. Can you go a little bit slower for the interpreters, por favor?
Okay. No
Gracias.
I'm sorry. Because of a patriarchal ethos and a modernist search for Western type of enlightenment and progress, seeking the paths of white European civilization. Such Occidentalist, patriarchal, socialist, or social democratic discourse was a staple of all tendencies within the letter barriada, thus locating it in the terrain of coloniality. Hence, Jorell's critique of the letter barriada as an historical formation with its domain of discourse, politics of knowledge, and forms of archival power implies a radicalization of Puerto Rican decolonial politics in tune with the current waves of decolonial movement in the archipelago. This leads me to my last point, and I really appreciate Joaquin's mentioning what's happening in the island right now at the end of his presentation. I was thinking of movements, social movement organizations such as the Colectiva Feminista en Construcción here. This leads me to my last point, which is how Jorell's argument about counter archives and the search for the unnamed corresponds to an embedded critical theory and a grounded radical politics in the present times. Here, I invoke the memory of Juana Colón, that act always remind me of my abuela, Ursula, long-term militant of the Socialist Party in the town of Comerío, who had the 5 carimbos marks of being black, poor, illiterate, slave descendant, and woman. As such, she was erased from hegemonic archives of both the letter city and the letter barriada. And that counterpoint between the letter city of Angel Rama and the letter barriada of Jorell there is a lot there. It was also mentioned by Joaquín. Nonetheless, as Jorell shows, quote, she became a mythical figure in the town's folklore and popular archive, end quote. And because of remembrance from civic activism that is now a public school and a community center in Comerío named after her. Mapping a complex cartography, Jorell also contends that in spite of the attempts of erasure in the hegemonic archives, her counter-archive is living because it was, here another quote, it was in the Socialist Party tribuna that a black illiterate woman like Juana was allowed to speak her mind and project herself as a leader, end quote. Playing that drum, he argues that, quote, it is imperative to recognize the importance of those who did not leave any written record, end quote. There is an element here in terms of the decolonial turn of what Hatibi, Derrida, and Walter Mignolo called double critique. You know, this is critique not from within the letter city and the letter barriada, but from outside. In the epilogue, the author ends laying out how the ideational archive of the letter barriada survived and get resignified in the historical hurricane that represented the reinvention of the nation and the new colonial deal led by Luis Muñoz Marín and the Partido Popular Democrático, as Marisol said. The Socialist Party was absorbed by the PPD, but left its political mark with the Progressive Bill of Rights that was too radical to be ratified by the colonial state and the metropolitan state as part of the new constitution. But the book planted the epistemic, methodological, and political seeds for the ongoing search to nurture the emerging archives with their name within dominant regimes of truth. Puerto Rico and Puerto Ricans possess our longue durée location not only as a colonial lab of historical coloniality, but as a global resource for refashioning the meanings and practices of decolonization. This book is an enduring contribution to this collective endeavor. Gracias, Jorell.
Muchísimas gracias. Thank you, Agustín, Laó-Montes, for those comments. I am now going to pass it to the author of The Lettered Barriada, Jorell Meléndez-Badillo, who will respond to the panelists' comments and provide some of his own as well.
Muchas gracias, Aurora. So I want to start first. Y'all make me cry throughout this. So thank you. I wanted to start by saying thank you to Marisol, Joaquín, and Agustín for their insightful comments, for their engagement with the book and with the text itself, and just for allowing me to be in community with all of you throughout the years. I think that this book, as any intellectual production and scholarship that I produce, is the product of conversations with colleagues, friends, and comrades. Also, thank you, Aurora, who's someone also very close to me, who I'm in community with constantly, for moderating, and also for the incredible work done by Colectivo Babilla. And I'm gonna try to slow down as I talk. Before I begin, I wanted to briefly make a comment about my bookshelf. And in part, it's because every time I attend an event like this, I'm always attentive to the books that are in the back. And so I want to simply highlight the work of people that I am in community with and that inspire my work. José Atiles, Jugando con el Derecho, my book Páginas Libres, Profanaciones del Verano del 2019 by José Atiles, Marisol, LeBrón, and Yarimar Borillas, Las Réplicas del Desastre, 45 by Christopher Powers, Against Puerto Rico by Marisol LeBrón, Arrancando Mitos de Raíz by Isaac Godró, Mariluz Franco, Hilda Llorens, and others, and Para la Posteridad. And having said that, I wanted to share with everyone a link with the websites of multiple bookstores in Puerto Rico, like Librería Laberinto. We have La Esquina in Santurce, La Mágica in Río Piedras, Norberto González in Río Piedras, Ana Torrey, La Casita in Aguadilla, El Candil in Ponce, and Libro 787, which is a website and a platform. All of them shipped to the United States. Or if you're interested in books produced in Puerto Rico by Puerto Ricans, please consider buying directly from these bookstores. Now, I did not prepare remarks. I wanted to engage with the comments that the panelists gave, and I again want to thank all of them for their engagement with the text. And I will not do justice to the brilliance that they shared with us today in addressing all of them, but I will try to go and address each speaker at least some of the points that they raised. First, I'll start with Marisol LeBrón's comments and her 3 points, which I want to address. First, the global dimension of the narrative and the project itself, that notion of co-optation, and the notion of the book as an archive. In terms of the global, one of the things that really struck me when I first started conducting research for this book is the ways that these enlightened workers, self-educated workers, were engaging in active dialogue with comrades, not only across the island, but also across the Caribbean, the Americas, and Europe. You had workers that had never left Puerto Rico. Some of them had never even seen the ocean and were theorizing about what people in Austria, Spain, Argentina, Brazil were theorizing about. So they felt that they were part of a community. And I'm glad that Marisol mentioned May Day and Labor Day, because in the book, I argue that these events not only had a local component, but by participating in May Day activities, as I try to demonstrate in the book, these workers saw themselves as part of something broader. They saw themselves as part of a global working class intellectual community, which is something I'll talk a little bit more when I address one of Joaquín's points. In terms of co-optation, I think this is an important point, not only because the PPD, the Popular Democratic Party, which basically led an electoral revolution in mid-20th century Puerto Rico, co-opted the discourses of these working class intellectuals, as I argued in the epilogue, but also the co-optation of these enlightened workers and the discourses of the masses. One of the things that I want to argue in the book is that it was a small group of working class intellectuals that were able to craft these historical narratives. And in the process, they saw themselves as the self-assigned interlocutors of the working classes. And when, as Agustín was mentioning, they crafted this notion of the ideal worker as always male or always raceless, i.e., and white, they were also co-opting the knowledges from those that they erased from the archive. And so I think that Juan Vilar, the anarchist, Black anarchist that Agustín was mentioning, is a perfect example of how the Federación Libre, which was the leading labor federation, co-opted his discourses and erased him from the archives. And I think this co-optation goes hand in hand with this concept of contradiction that Joaquín brought, and that's also central in Lorgia Garcia Peña's work, which is highly influential on my own thinking. I also appreciated, Marisol, how you talked about archives, both the book as an archive and also the material repositories that we have in the archipelago and how frail they are. As we talked about a couple of weeks ago in the interview, if I were to do this book now in the present, I could not do it. In part is because archives in Puerto Rico are not kept up, they're not maintained, there are no funds for it, much less a working class archive. And I think this is important because although these archives like El Centro de Documentación Obrera, which was the archive that I heavily consulted for this book and that was destroyed by 2017 Hurricane Maria, that archive was created to highlight one of the central myths of working class intellectual communities, which was the myth of Santiago Iglesias Pantin, a Spanish worker that arrived in Puerto Rico in 1897 as the creator of the labor movement. And so although the archive was created to highlight that myth that I tried to de-articulate and deconstruct in the book, it was still invaluable for me to read against the grain and weave together these narratives. And so thank you, Marisol, for those comments. Joaquín, I wrote down 3 points that I wanted to highlight and that I wanted to engage with and I wanted to think through, which is the first, that notion of contradiction that I was mentioning when addressing Marisol's comments. I think it's crucial. These people that I study in the book were walking contradictions, as we all are. One of the things that I try to do in the book is to take seriously the way that these obreros ilustrados saw themselves. They were not monolithic ideologues. They saw themselves not only as socialist agitators and workers, but some of them saw themselves as poets, as littérateurs. Some of them saw themselves as essayists. They saw themselves as journalists, and I took that very seriously. But also I took very seriously the ways that they contradicted each other. And so, for example, one of the ways that they contradicted themselves is by articulating a class discourse to unify the working classes while silencing gender and race. And so I think that notion of contradictions, again, in Lourdes Garcia Peña's book on the Dominican Republic, she does a fantastic work of unpacking contradictions. It's crucial for me to think about what I do in the book. Second, I knew that this geography comment was coming because we've been in conversation for a long time, but I think that you highlight something that I did not do in the book, but I think the book might be helpful for me to continue thinking about this. As Marisol was mentioning, one of the arguments that I make is that these workers saw themselves and understood themselves and believed themselves to be global subjects. And that's something that's a core element of the book. I think that in your comments, you're highlighting to the global dimensions of space and the arrabal, the centros, as global spaces. And so I think that's an important way to think about it. And it makes me think of two books, Raymond Crabe's The City of the Renegade, which is a book on Chile and anarchism in early 20th century, and how anarchists in Chile were creating global imaginaries without moving outside of Chile. And also thinking about Dave Strutter's book on Los Angeles, The World in a City, and thinking about places as global themselves. However, I do want to push back a little bit on that and argue that the people that I study might have inhabited arrabales, barriadas, and all these working class spaces, but they constituted a minority within the broader working classes. And so I just don't want to lose sight of the fact that these were a small group of people that, because they dominated the means of working class knowledge production, they were able to dictate what we consider history in early 20th century, which is a point that I'll make when I'm addressing Agustín. And the last point is, I just wanted to echo that notion of workers as learned minds. Oftentimes, working class intellectuals, when the nation was being crafted throughout the 19th and 20th century in Puerto Rico, labor was a crucial component in the ways that intellectuals imagined the nation. However, workers were not part of those conversations. Labor was crucial, but those that produced that labor were not part of the conversation. And so I think it is very important for me to highlight the fact that they saw themselves as learned minds. Lastly, to address Agustín, I am very flattered with the Novísimo Historia, La Novísima Historia, because in part, one of the things that I wanted to do in this book was not to break from the work that the people that came before have done, particularly thinking about that 1970s historiography. And as you mentioned, CEREP, the Center for the Study of Puerto Rican Reality, just turned 50 recently, but it was also a tribute to them. And so I tell this to a friend, a colleague, a mentor, Angel Chuco Quintero. I tell him that in the book, I am critically reading what he did, but at the same time, I see it as a way of honoring the work that they did before me, perdón. And so in that part, I am flattered, and it's also a way to try to read the same sources that they were reading from a different lens. But I just wanted to address 3 points that Agustín made. And so the first one was the complex terrain of gender and race. And I just wanted to echo and highlight the importance of Juan Vilar in understanding this. And I think that you brought it up in your comments, and I appreciate that, because Juan Vilar allows us to see the ways that a Black cigar maker, a total badass, he was the organizer for the first anarchist group in Puerto Rico, Solidaridad, which began in 1905. He was a labor agitator. He was an anarchist. I think he was also a spiritist because he would publish in spiritist newspapers. And in 1911, he was arrested after a raid in a social studies center. And I found his letters to the Labor Federation asking why was he abandoned. He had dedicated his life to the Labor Federation. So Juan Vilar was not only erased from labor narratives, he was also excluded and ostracized while alive. And so he died in 1915 on poverty. He died poor and he died forgotten. He was one of the most famous obreros ilustrados of his time. And 10 years later, he was completely forgotten and erased from labor narratives. And as Agustín was mentioning, in the book, I argue that he was erased because he participated in the creation of a historical archive that had no space for him because he was Black. And also because he was an anarchist at a moment in which the Labor Federation was trying to erase and silence anarchism. In terms of the multiple meanings of colonialism and coloniality, Agustín, I also appreciated your comments because this was also one of the comments that one of the anonymous readers made initially for the manuscript. And so one of the anonymous readers asked, why didn't I make colonialism the central analytical axis of the book? And so one of the things that I wanted to do was to detach politics from that binary of resistance or integration to the US empire. I think that US empire is crucial. I think that colonialism at the turn of the 20th century is crucial to understand society, the polity that emerged after 1898. However, I think that framing the book within that binary would curtail other forms of radical expressions that I wanted to explore in the book. And so in the book, I don't do this directly as much, but I have another article that accompanied the book that was published in the Hispanic American Historical Review, which is an analysis of the Socialist Party and their take on prisons. First, they articulated a prison abolition discourse, and then it was tuned down and became more reformist. However, it was one of the most radical discourses from a political party, the Socialist Party, in the 1920s. And it was also erased from the historiography because the leaders of the Socialist Party favored the annexation of Puerto Rico to the United States. And so in a sense, I was also reading against a nationalist historiography that sought to erase the people that I study because of their political inclinations towards the United States. And they were problematic, they were messy, but I was interested in other forms of politics that challenged the coloniality of power and how it operated in early 20th century Puerto Rico. And my last comment, I know I'm standing and I'm stretching this and we want to open it for discussion, is on the transhistorical dimensions of the work that I'm trying to do. And so I appreciated Joaquín mentioning the struggles that are happening right now in Puerto Rico, particularly with the teachers, with public employees, firefighters, etc. And Juana Colón as well, because one of the things that I argue in the book is that the historical archives and the narratives that these working class intellectuals articulated at the turn of the 20th century still carry great power in the present day, particularly when we think about the 1970s historiographical movement and how they started doing history from below. They were bringing the worker as a subject of study into the ivory tower of the university, but they did not critically interrogate the archives they were reading. They left some master codes intact. And so some of the silences that were produced actively and forcefully by obreros ilustrados at the beginning of the 20th century still carry enormous trans-historical power in the present and how we think about not only working class history, but also how we think about the history of Puerto Rico at the turn of the 20th century. And one of the things that I also was thinking about when I was writing this book was the political moment that we were living in with the creation of El Partido del Pueblo Trabajador in Puerto Rico, and then the coalition that was built around Movimiento Victoria Ciudadana. And for me, it was quite impressive in the ways that the Socialist Party in 1932 attained political power, both in 1932 and 1936, through a coalition with their class enemies, the Republican Party, and how it ripped the party apart. And so I think there are some lessons there to think about how we think about politics in contemporary Puerto Rico. Having said that, I appreciate and I appreciate all of the comments, all of the insightful readings of the book, and I look forward to opening it for discussion. You all honor me to allow me to be in community with you all. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Jorell Meléndez-Badillo. My camera will be off for now because I am having a canine struggle right now. So I will first begin by reading one comment and opening it up also to the Q&A for folks to ask questions. This one is from Blanca Ortiz. Congratulations, Jorell, a marvelous contribution to Puerto Rican historiography. Excellent presentations. I appreciated the diverse and interesting dimensions brought up by the three of you. Thank you. And so if anyone else would like to ask any questions, we are open to them right now. And if the rest of the panelists would like to turn on their cameras, please feel free and welcome to, so we can all see each other.
So I wonder if I can ask a question while we let things percolate and let some questions hopefully populate the chat and the Q&A function. But one is, this was wonderful, and it was so wonderful, Agustín and Joaquín, to hear your thoughts and an analysis of the text. It was really wonderful to be in conversation with everyone. But Jorell, I have a question, which is like a question I love to ask people when they're done with this process, which is there anything you left out of the book that you really wish you had included, right? Like, I talk about it as like the shadow book. Like, what's the thing you wish you could have written about, but maybe you didn't have enough documentation, or you felt like you didn't have maybe the expertise to kind of include it in the book. I'm curious if there's anything like that kind of didn't make it in that you wish you had been able to speak about.
Gracias, Marisol. Yeah, absolutely. So actually that last section of the book, the epilogue, was supposed to be a longer chapter to trace the power of the myths and the discourses and the narratives that Obreros Ilustrados built at the turn of the 20th century. And it was going to end with the current political moment in Puerto Rico. And so there was a commentary, actually it was written and it was taken out because one of the readers suggested it, and I agreed because it needed more work. But it was also an intervention into how Puerto Rican historiography addressed working class history in the 1970s. So I was going to engage with that historiography and then try to think about the meanings of my work in the contemporary moment. But I think I didn't have the time to fully flesh it out and develop it. And so one of the readers pointed it out and I agreed. And so it was taken out, but it was about the trans-historical power of the story that I'm trying to tell. Because I didn't want it to be just a story of early 20th century Puerto Rico and that's it. Because one of the arguments that I'm trying to make is that not only the archives that I'm working on, but I'm trying to think more broadly about the trans-historical power of archives and counter archives across historiographies, right? Not only for Puerto Rico, but what, how the ways that we craft certain narratives, or that individuals craft certain narratives at certain historical moments, still carry power centuries or decades later.
Thank you.
Gracias.
So we have some comments or there's a question actually here saying, well, people congratulating you, obviously, for such an amazing book. But also Robert Alegre has a question about, what do you think, Jorell, about the function of poetry to anarchist politics? Crabe's book, Raymond Crabe, also includes a bunch of poets, and poets have been political in Chile and Nicaragua, among other places. Gracias.
Great, thank you. Gracias, Rob, por la pregunta y por estar aquí. Yeah, poetry was crucial, the same way that theatrical plays was crucial. I think that one of the things that I want to do in the book is to think critically about the ways that the propaganda that Puerto Rican historiography has traditionally looked at in terms of working class knowledge production was also signaling the creation of another literary sensibility, a working class literary sensibility. And so one of the people that I document in the book and that I follow is Cruz, who's also in my book, Páginas Libres. I reproduced one of his books. He was actually a poet. And so when you read the ways that poetry was read and consumed by other working class intellectuals, you see the crucial role that poetry had for revolutionary thinking in Puerto Rico, right? Also, thinking about space, and one of the comments made by Joaquín, they were also thinking about how to move literary production beyond their social studies sectors. And so, for example, theatrical plays would be, they would travel with, they had theater groups that would travel throughout the island. One of the things that I'm really interested in, and hopefully I will write about this in the future, is the role of children. Children played a huge role in these cultural worlds that they created. They had poetry groups composed by children, children's choir that would participate actively in this cultural world. So I think that, like Ray documents in his book, I think that poetry, theatrical plays, essays, novels were crucial for workers to not only create another working class sensibility, but also to imagine other worlds and challenge the limits of what could be said and done in a traditional political discourse. And so they would use poetry and literature to experiment with those. It could be a sense of instead of world making, other world making through literature and aesthetics. And also, I think it's amazing that the only literary working class magazine that has been published in Puerto Rico was published in 1911 by this group of folks. So they even had a literary magazine, a working class literary magazine that not only reproduced literary texts from the working classes, but also the great works of, European intellectuals, which is also problematic because it allowed them to use those European intellectuals to silence race and gender locally.
Great, thank you so much for answering that. Any questions, any comments? I have been told that we are not all seen. If we could put it in a gallery view, then all of the speakers would be seen at the same time. I don't know if that's possible within the function.
I think we are in gallery.
Because it is on speaker view.
Quizás Cristo.
Okay, now it works. So I think now we're good.
Great.
Any other questions, comments?
Si estamos cansados, yo creo que ya podemos ir a darnos la cervecita, el vinito, la cena. Muchísimas gracias a todas y todos por compartir el espacio y también por permitirme estar en comunidad. Para mí, en realidad, cuando dije que por poco me hacen llorar o que me hicieron, it was legit. Your comments make me tear up. So thank you. I appreciate you all. and to everyone that was here, all the people that attended, thank you very much.
Muchas gracias. Thank you a todos por estar aquí. I appreciate so much the panelists and the work of Colectivo Avilla for their interpretation. So you already know Duke University Press, the lettered Barriada, and check out those links for the amazing work of Editorial Educación Emergente. Marisol is showing the book. I highly recommend. So thank you so much for being here, everybody. I hope you have a great evening.